I'll never forget the way his eyes glinted when he looked at me that first time. Khalid al-Sarik, a man so enigmatic that even the air around him seemed charged with mystery. He wasn't just a millionaire. He was a legend in Dubai's high society. Every whispered word about him painted a portrait of extravagance and power. But no one really knew him, not fully. And then there was me, Sophie Cartwright, a modest art curator from London with debts that threatened to swallow me whole. How I ended up in Khalid's orbit was as surreal as it was intoxicating. It started when I was invited to curate a private gallery in Dubai. I'd been struggling to land a steady gig, and this opportunity seemed like a gift from the heavens. Little did I know, Khalid was behind the invitation. He'd seen my work through a mutual connection and wanted to meet me in person. When we finally met at the gallery, his presence was magnetic. He towered over everyone in the room, his tailored suit exuding wealth and sophistication. But it wasn't just his money. It was the way he moved, the way he commanded attention without speaking a word. "Miss Cartwright," he'd said, his deep voice tinged with an accent that made my name sound like a melody. "Your art has soul. I'd like to know the woman behind it." That night led to dinners, private yacht tours, and late-night conversations that felt both thrilling and intimate. Khalid had a way of making you feel like the only person in the world, like your every thought mattered. By the time he proposed, barely 3 months after we met, I was completely under his spell. "Marry me, Sophie," he whispered one evening on his sprawling balcony overlooking the Dubai marina. "I'll give you a life you can't even imagine." It was whirlwind, it was reckless, and I said yes. Our wedding was as extravagant as you'd expect. Held in his desert villa, it was a fusion of opulence and tradition. Guests flew in from all over the world, and the ceremony was a spectacle of gold and crimson silks, sparkling chandeliers, and fountains overflowing with champagne. Khalid was uncharacteristically quiet that day, his gaze distant even as he slipped the diamond-studded band onto my finger. "Are you all right?" I whispered to him as we shared our first dance. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Just thinking about tomorrow," he said cryptically. The next morning, Khalid was dead. I woke up to the sound of frantic voices and footsteps echoing through the villa. When I found him, he was slumped over in his study, his hand clutching a half-written note. His once commanding presence was reduced to a still, lifeless figure. The doctors said it was a heart attack, but the whispers began almost immediately. In a world as cutthroat as Khalid's, people rarely die without a storm of rumors following. I was still reeling from the shock when the complications began. Khalid hadn't just left behind a grieving widow, he'd left behind an empire. Within hours, lawyers, business associates, and distant family members were swarming the villa like vultures. Khalid trusted no one. His chief advisor, Youssef, told me that afternoon, "But he left instructions for you. You must meet with his lawyer." I barely had time to process the gravity of his words before I was ushered into a sleek, black car. The drive to the lawyer's office felt surreal, the desert landscape blurring past like a dream. Inside the office, a man in a sharp suit greeted me with a mix of professionalism and pity. "Mrs. Al-Sarik," he began, sliding a thick envelope across the table. "This contains Khalid's final will and testament. He made some unique arrangements." "What kind of arrangements?" I asked, my voice trembling. The lawyer's expression was unreadable as he opened the envelope and began to read. "To my wife, Sophie," he said, "I leave control of all my assets, properties, and businesses." The room spun. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "But there's a condition," the lawyer continued, his tone suddenly grave. "You must remain in Dubai for 1 year. If you leave before that time, everything will be forfeited to my brother, Samir." "Samir?" I echoed. Khalid had never mentioned a brother. The lawyer nodded. "He's complicated. And you should know, he's already contested the will." The next few days were a blur of confusion and suspicion. Khalid's death felt too sudden, too convenient for those who stood to gain from it. And Samir? He arrived at the villa like a storm, his presence as dark and imposing as Khalid's had been magnetic. "You're not one of us," Samir said the first time we met, his eyes cold as steel. You don't belong in Khalid's world, and you won't survive it. But I wasn't about to back down. Not yet. Cliffhanger ending for part 1. That night, I found the note Khalid had been writing before he died. It was hidden in the lining of his desk drawer, its words scrawled hastily, as if he'd known his time was running out. Sophie, trust no one. Not even. The note ended abruptly, the last words smeared with ink. Not even who? As I sat there, staring at the unfinished warning, the lights in the villa flickered, and a shadow moved in the doorway behind me. The shadow lingered in the doorway, and my pulse quickened. Who's there? I demanded, clutching Khalid's note tightly in my hand. For a moment, silence answered me. Then Samir stepped into the dim light of the room, his expression unreadable. Still snooping, I see, he said, his voice low and sharp. Not the best habit to develop in a house like this. My grip on the note tightened. This is my house now, I said, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. Samir smirked, leaning casually against the doorframe. Is it? Don't get too comfortable, Sophie. Khalid may have left you the empire, but trust me, you won't keep it. Over the next few days, Samir made his presence felt in every corner of the villa. He moved with the confidence of a man who believed he owned the place, issuing commands to the staff and taking meetings in Khalid's study as though it were his own. You need to assert yourself, Youssef told me one morning. If you don't take control, Samir will dismantle everything Khalid built. But it wasn't that simple. Samir wasn't just a threat. He was a puzzle. He seemed to know more about Khalid's dealings than anyone else, yet he refused to share any useful information. Every conversation with him felt like a test, as if he were waiting for me to slip up. And then there were the whispers. The staff spoke in hushed tones about Samir's past, his connections to dangerous people, and the mysterious circumstances surrounding his estrangement from Khalid. He was exiled from the family, Youssef said when I pressed him for details. No one knows exactly why. But when Khalid's father died, Samir lost everything. Everything? I asked. Youssef nodded. The will left it all to Khalid. And Samir, he never forgave him for it. One evening, I decided to confront Samir directly. I found him in the garden, smoking a cigar and staring out at the desert as the sun dipped below the horizon. Why are you really here? I asked, stepping into the fading light. He turned to me, his eyes glinting like steel. Why are you here, Sophie? Do you even know? I'm here because Khalid wanted me to be, I said firmly. Samir laughed, a sound as cold as the desert night. You think Khalid trusted you? You think he loved you? He shook his head, his smirk fading. You have no idea who my brother really was. Then tell me, I challenged. If you're so certain I'm in over my head, why not enlighten me? Samir took a long drag of his cigar, his gaze never leaving mine. Fine, he said. Tomorrow, I'll show you exactly what you've inherited. But don't say I didn't warn you. The next day, Samir took me to a building I'd never seen before, tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. Inside, the air was cool and sterile, the walls lined with shelves of leather-bound ledgers and folders. This is the heart of Khalid's empire, Samir said, gesturing to the rows of documents. Every deal, every investment, every secret, it's all here. I stared at the shelves, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of information. Why are you showing me this? Because you need to understand the stakes, he said, his voice low and serious. This isn't just about money, Sophie. Khalid's empire is built on alliances, debts, and leverage. If you don't know how to navigate it, you'll be eaten alive. He pulled a folder from the shelf and handed it to me. Inside were photos, invoices, and cryptic notes written in Khalid's handwriting. What is this? I asked, flipping through the pages. Your first lesson, Samir said. Khalid wasn't the saint you thought he was. These are his deals with Al Hamid Holdings, a group with ties to unsavory enterprises. Unsavory? I echoed, my stomach turning. Smuggling, money laundering, arms deals, Samir said bluntly. This is the world you've stepped into, Sophie. And now, it's your problem. That night, I couldn't sleep. The weight of what I'd seen in that folder pressed down on me like a storm cloud. Khalid had always seemed larger than life, a man untouchable by the shadows of the world. But now, those shadows were creeping closer, threatening to consume everything he'd left behind. And then there was the note, the unfinished warning Khalid had written before his death. Trust no one. Not even Samir? Not even Yusef? Or had Khalid meant someone else entirely? The next morning, I awoke to chaos. The villa was swarming with police, their presence a stark contrast to the opulence of the surroundings. What's going on? I demanded, rushing down the grand staircase. Yusef intercepted me, his expression grim. They're here for the ledgers, he said. Someone tipped them off. My blood ran cold. What do you mean? Who would do that? Yusef hesitated, his eyes darting toward the doorway where Samir stood, watching the scene unfold with a faint smirk. Be careful, Mrs. Al-Sarek, Yusef said quietly. The timing of this, it's no coincidence. Cliffhanger ending for part 2. That evening, as I sifted through the remnants of Khalid's documents, a single envelope caught my eye. It was addressed to me, sealed with Khalid's insignia. Inside was a key and a note that read, Sophie, if you're reading this, you're in danger. Trust the key. It will lead you to the truth. As I held the key in my trembling hand, a knock sounded at my door. Mrs. Al-Sarek, a voice called from the other side. We need to talk. But when I opened the door, no one was there. Just a single rose lying on the floor, its petals black as night. The black rose lay on the marble floor, its eerie petals soaking up the light like shadows incarnate. My stomach twisted as I picked it up, my thoughts racing. Was this a warning? A threat? Or was someone playing a game far more dangerous than I could imagine? Khalid's key felt heavy in my pocket, its purpose still a mystery. The cryptic note he'd left haunted me. Trust the key. It will lead you to the truth. But what truth? And why did it feel like I was walking into a trap with every step I took? That night, I didn't sleep. Instead, I pored over Khalid's ledgers, trying to make sense of the tangled web he'd left behind. Numbers, names, deals, they blurred together in my exhausted mind. But then, a pattern began to emerge. The key wasn't just physical, it was metaphorical. Khalid had always been obsessed with symmetry and hidden meanings. The ledger entries marked with a small crescent moon symbol seemed unrelated at first glance, but when I traced them back to their origins, they all pointed to a single name, Jumana Trading Group. Yusef confirmed my suspicions the next morning. Jumana was one of Khalid's most trusted partners, he said, lowering his voice. But their dealings were complicated. Complicated how? I asked. They handled shipments for him, luxury goods on the surface, but beneath that other things. Things Khalid never spoke about openly. The weight of his words settled over me like a dark cloud. Khalid's empire wasn't just built on wealth and charm. It was built on secrets. Samir, of course, was quick to pounce on my newfound discovery. So, you found Jumana, he said, his smirk as sharp as ever. I was wondering how long it would take. Do you know what Khalid was hiding? I asked, unwilling to let him see my unease. More than you're ready to hear, he said cryptically. Try me. I shot back. Samir's smirk faded, replaced by something darker. Jumana isn't just a company, Sophie. It's a gateway, a network of connections Khalid used to stay one step ahead of his enemies. But now that he's gone, those enemies are circling. I swallowed hard. What kind of enemies? The kind who won't stop until they've taken everything, Samir said. Later that day, I used Khalid's key for the first time. It unlocked a hidden compartment in his study, a compartment I hadn't even noticed until Yusef pointed out the faint outline of a panel in the wall. Inside, I found a collection of documents, photographs, and a USB drive. The photographs were unsettling, images of men I didn't recognize, each one marked with a red X across their faces. Targets, Yusef said when I showed him the photos. Khalid was keeping tabs on his rivals. And these? I asked, holding up the USB drive. Yusef hesitated. If Khalid wanted you to find it, then you should see for yourself. The contents of the USB drive were more damning than I could have imagined. It contained video recordings of meetings, audio files of conversations, and emails that detailed Khalid's dealings with Jumana Trading Group. One video in particular caught my attention. It showed Khalid meeting with a man whose face was partially obscured, their conversation tense and heated. "You're making a mistake," the man said, his voice low and threatening. Khalid leaned back in his chair, his expression calm but resolute. "The only mistake would be trusting you." The video ended abruptly, but the timestamp suggested it was recorded just days before Khalid's death. "Who is he?" I asked Youssef, pointing to the man in the video. Youssef's face paled. "That's Faisal Al-Harith," he said, "one of Jumana's most powerful players." If Khalid crossed him, he didn't need to finish the sentence. That evening, I confronted Samir again. "Why didn't you tell me about Faisal?" I demanded. Samir's eyes narrowed. "Because Faisal is the reason Khalid is dead." The air seemed to leave the room. "What are you talking about?" "Khalid didn't die of a heart attack," Samir said, his voice low and deliberate. "He was poisoned, and Faisal is the only person with the motive and the means to do it." The revelation left me reeling. If Khalid had been murdered, then my presence in Dubai wasn't just a matter of inheritance, it was a matter of survival. But Samir wasn't done. "There's something else you need to know," he said. Khalid suspected Faisal was working with someone inside the family. Someone close to him. "Someone like you?" I shot back, unable to hide my suspicion. Samir's smirk returned. "You'll have to figure that out for yourself, won't you?" Cliffhanger ending for part 3. That night, as I tried to piece together the truth, I received an anonymous email. The subject line read, "The next move is yours." Attached was a single file, a photograph of me and Khalid on our wedding day, with a red X slashed across my face. And beneath it, a message, "Trust no one, not even the dead." The photograph burned in my mind long after I'd closed the email. The red X across my face wasn't just a warning. It was a promise. Someone wanted me gone, just like Khalid. But who? Every glance, every conversation, every shadow now felt like a threat. Samir, Youssef, the staff. None of them could be trusted. And then there was Faisal, the puppet master lurking somewhere in the background, pulling strings I didn't fully understand. The message's cryptic line, "Trust no one, not even the dead," haunted me. Khalid had left me clues, but they only led to more questions. The next morning, I received a summons. Faisal Al-Harith wanted to meet me. "Don't go," Youssef warned. "Faisal is dangerous. He doesn't summon people for polite conversations." "What choice do I have?" I countered. "If he killed Khalid, he's already made his move. I need to know what he wants." Youssef hesitated, then handed me a small device. "Take this. It's a recorder. If anything happens, we'll have proof." Faisal's estate was a fortress, a sprawling compound surrounded by high walls and armed guards. Inside, the air was thick with opulence and menace. "Mrs. Al-Sarek," Faisal said as I entered his private sitting room. His voice was smooth, almost charming, but his eyes were sharp and predatory. "It's an honor to finally meet Khalid's widow." "Is it?" I asked, refusing to let him see my fear. "Because it feels like more of a threat?" Faisal chuckled, gesturing for me to sit. "You're bold, I'll give you that." Khalid always admired boldness. But boldness can be a liability in the wrong hands. "What do you want, Faisal?" I asked, cutting to the chase. He leaned forward, his expression darkening. "I want what's mine. Khalid owed me. Money, favors, trust. And now, with him gone, those debts fall to you." "I don't owe you anything," I said firmly. "Don't be naive," Faisal said, his voice hardening. Khalid's empire was built on alliances, and I was his most important ally. If you want to keep what's left of his legacy, you'll honor those alliances. "And if I don't?" Faisal's smile was cold. "Then you'll join him in the ground." When I returned to the villa, Samir was waiting for me in the study. "How did it go?" he asked, his tone unreadable. "Faisal wants me to settle Khalid's debts," I said, slumping into a chair. "And what did you say?" that I don't owe him anything. Samir laughed, shaking his head. Brave, but foolish. Faisal doesn't take no for an answer. Then help me, I said. If you want Khalid's empire as much as Faisal does, you have as much to lose as I do. Samir's smirk faded, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something resembling sincerity in his eyes. All right, he said. But if we're going to take Faisal down, we need to act fast. He's not the type to wait. Samir's plan was bold, bordering on reckless. He wanted to use Khalid's files, the ones hidden in the ledgers and USB drive, as leverage against Faisal. We'll expose his operations, Samir said. Smuggling, money laundering, arms deals, everything. Once his network crumbles, he'll have no power left to threaten us. And what happens if we fail? I asked. Samir's expression darkened. We won't fail. The next few days were a whirlwind of preparation. Youssef worked to encrypt the files, while Samir arranged a meeting with one of Faisal's rivals, a man named Omar Sharif. Omar has been waiting for an opportunity to take Faisal down, Samir explained. If we give him the files, he'll do the dirty work for us. Are you sure we can trust him? I asked. No, Samir said bluntly, but it's our best shot. The meeting with Omar took place in a remote desert location, far from prying eyes. Samir, Youssef, and I arrived just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the sand. Omar was a tall, imposing man with a sharp gaze and an air of authority. He listened intently as Samir explained our plan, his expression unreadable. These files are valuable, Omar said finally, but they're also dangerous. If Faisal finds out you've betrayed him, he won't, Samir interrupted. Not until it's too late. Omar studied us for a long moment before nodding. Very well. I'll handle Faisal. But if this backfires, you're on your own. Cliffhanger ending for part 4. As we returned to the villa, a sense of unease settled over me. Something about the meeting hadn't felt right. That night, I woke to the sound of footsteps outside my bedroom door. I froze, my heart pounding. Who's there? I called, my voice trembling. The footsteps paused, and then a low voice replied, You made a mistake, Sophie. Now you'll pay for it. Before I could react, the door burst open, and a shadowy figure lunged toward me. The figure lunged toward me, and instinct took over. I grabbed the lamp from the bedside table and swung it with all my strength. It shattered against the intruder's arm, and he stumbled back with a grunt of pain. I scrambled for the door, heart pounding, but he recovered too quickly. His hand grabbed my wrist, twisting it painfully. You should have stayed out of this, he growled, his face obscured by a mask. Just as I felt my strength faltering, another sound broke through the chaos, a shout, followed by heavy footsteps. The door flew open, and Samir appeared, a gun in his hand. Let her go, Samir ordered, his voice cold and steady. The intruder hesitated for a fraction of a second, then released me and bolted for the window. Samir fired a warning shot, but the man was already gone, disappearing into the shadows of the night. The aftermath was a blur of adrenaline and fear. Samir sat me down, his expression grim. Who was that? I demanded, my voice shaking. Samir hesitated. A message from Faisal. He knows about the files. My blood ran cold. How? Omar promised. Omar betrayed us, Samir interrupted. He sold us out to Faisal. The files are planned. He gave him everything. The next morning, the villa was in chaos. Youssef confirmed that our encrypted files had been stolen, and Faisal's network was now fully aware of our actions. They'll come for you, Youssef said, his voice heavy with regret. Faisal doesn't leave loose ends. Then we don't give him the chance, Samir said. We go on the offensive. I stared at him, incredulous. How? He has the files, the leverage, and the resources. What do we have? Samir's smirk returned, though it was tinged with desperation. We have each other, and we have one last card to play. Samir's plan was simple, yet dangerous. He had contacts who could access Faisal's private accounts, proof of his illegal dealings. If we could leak that information to the authorities, Faisal's empire would collapse overnight. But it would require something we didn't have: time. Faisal won't wait, Youssef warned. The longer we stay here, the more vulnerable we are. I'm not running, I said, my voice firm. Khalid didn't build this empire just for Faisal to destroy it. We fight. Samir nodded, his expression unreadable. Then let's finish this. The final confrontation took place in the same desert compound where Faisal had first summoned me. Samir and I arrived under the pretense of surrender, while Youssef worked behind the scenes to release the damning evidence. Faisal greeted us with his usual predatory charm, though his guards' weapons betrayed the hostility beneath the surface. "Brave of you to come here," Faisal said, his voice dripping with mockery. "I almost admire it." "This ends tonight," I said, stepping forward. "You killed Khalid. You tried to kill me. But it's over. Your empire is finished." Faisal laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "And what makes you think that?" "Because by now, the authorities have everything they need to take you down," Samir said, his voice steady. "Your accounts, your deals, your network, it's all public." For the first time, Faisal's confidence wavered. He pulled out his phone, his eyes narrowing as he scrolled through frantic messages. "You're bluffing," he said, though his tone betrayed his doubt. "Am I?" Samir asked, a dangerous edge in his voice. The next moments unfolded in chaos. Faisal barked orders to his guards, but before they could act, the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. Lights flashed in the distance, and the compound was soon surrounded by law enforcement. Samir grabbed my hand, pulling me toward the exit as the scene descended into a frenzy. "Move!" he shouted, his voice barely audible over the commotion. We barely made it out before the authorities stormed the compound, arresting Faisal and his men. In the days that followed, the dust began to settle. Faisal's empire crumbled under the weight of the evidence, and his allies scattered. Omar disappeared, his betrayal cutting off any chance of redemption. And Samir? He surprised me. "I'm leaving," he said one evening as we sat in the villa's garden. "Leaving?" I echoed, startled. "This was never my world," he said, "and I don't want it to be. Khalid's empire is yours now. Do with it what you will." As for me, I finally understood the truth of Khalid's warning: trust no one. In the end, I chose to dismantle the empire he had built, piece by piece. The wealth, the power, it wasn't worth the cost. Instead, I returned to London, leaving Dubai and its shadows behind. But the memories stayed with me. The black rose, the red X, the secrets that had unraveled my life. They were scars I would carry forever. Epilogue. Months later, I received a package in the mail. Inside was a single rose, red this time, and a note that read, "In another life, we might have been allies." Samir's game wasn't over. And deep down, I knew mine wasn't either. The red rose sat on my desk, its vibrant petals a sharp contrast to the gray skies outside my London flat. The note from Samir replayed in my mind. In another life, we might have been allies. It was maddeningly cryptic, much like the man himself. Was this his way of saying goodbye, or was it a promise of things yet to come? I tried to move on, pouring my energy into rebuilding the art career I'd abandoned when I married Khalid. But the memories of Dubai clung to me like smoke. Samir's smirk, Faisal's threats, the weight of Khalid's empire pressing down on me. And then there was the nagging sense that I wasn't done with that world. Months passed before the shadows came creeping back. It started with a phone call from Youssef. "I thought you should know," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "Someone's been asking about you." "Who?" I asked, my stomach sinking. "I'm not sure," he admitted, "but they're connected to Faisal's network. I think they're looking for something you have." My blood ran cold. Faisal's empire had fallen, but its remnants were clearly still active. And if they were targeting me, it meant they believed I had something valuable. A week later, the first real sign of trouble appeared. I came home one evening to find my flat ransacked. Drawers were overturned, furniture was slashed, and the contents of my personal safe were missing. But what struck me most was what they hadn't taken. Khalid's key, still tucked away in my jewelry box, was untouched. Whoever had broken in wasn't looking for money or valuables. They were looking for answers. The next morning, I received an encrypted email. The sender's address was untraceable, but the message was clear. Return to Dubai. We need to talk. Attached was a photograph of Samir, sitting at a cafe. He was alone, but the image felt like a message. Whoever had sent it wanted me to believe that Samir was involved. Against my better judgment, I boarded a plane to Dubai. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was a trap, but I also couldn't ignore the pull of unfinished business. When I arrived, Youssef was waiting for me at the airport. You shouldn't have come, he said, his face lined with worry. Do I have a choice? I asked. Youssef didn't answer. Instead, he handed me a dossier. Inside were documents detailing a resurgence of Faisal's network. Only now, it wasn't Faisal at the helm. It was Omar. Omar's betrayal had been devastating, but his rise to power was even more troubling. According to Youssef, he had spent months consolidating Faisal's old connections, using them to rebuild the network stronger than ever. And now, he was targeting anyone who had played a role in its downfall, including me. I can protect you, Youssef said, but you need to be careful. Omar isn't just after revenge. He wants control. Control of what? I asked. Youssef hesitated, then handed me a second folder. Inside was a photograph of Khalid's key, along with a series of notes in Arabic. The key unlocks more than just a compartment in Khalid's study, Youssef said. It's a symbol, proof of ownership over a vault containing some of Khalid's most valuable secrets. My heart raced. Khalid had left me the key, but I'd never understood its true significance. Now, it seemed, everyone else did. I met Samir the next day, in the same cafe where his photograph had been taken. He looked up as I approached, his expression a mix of amusement and wariness. So, he said, gesturing to the empty seat across from him, you came. Cut the games, Samir, I said, sitting down. Why are people after me? What's in the vault? Samir leaned back in his chair, studying me. You're asking the wrong question, he said. The better question is, why did Khalid give you the key? Samir's words stayed with me long after our meeting. Why had Khalid trusted me with something so important? And what was I supposed to do with it? That night, as I lay awake in my hotel room, my phone buzzed with a message. It was from Youssef. I found the vault's location, but you won't like what's inside. The vault was hidden beneath an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Youssef and I arrived just before dawn, the air thick with tension. The key fit perfectly into the lock, and the door creaked open to reveal a dimly lit chamber. Inside were rows of shelves, each one lined with documents, tapes, and artifacts. At the center of the room was a single pedestal. On it sat a ledger, its cover embossed with Khalid's insignia. This is it, Youssef said, his voice hushed. Khalid's master ledger. Every deal, every secret, every leverage point. Right here. My hands trembled as I opened the ledger. The names inside were a who's who of powerful figures, each one tied to Khalid in ways that could ruin them if exposed. This is why they're after you, Youssef said. This ledger is the ultimate weapon. Cliffhanger ending for part 6. Before I could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed through the vault. Youssef drew his weapon, his eyes scanning the shadows. Put the ledger down, Sophie, a voice called out. Omar stepped into the light, flanked by armed guards. His smile was cold and triumphant. Did you really think I'd let you keep Khalid's secrets? He said. As the guards closed in, I realized the truth. The game wasn't over. It was only just beginning.